2 days ago, when I was loading our old photos into the digital frame my son had bought me, I noticed him. In a family picnic photo from 1972, standing in the background, looking at us and smiling. This was impossible, because that man was my husband, whom I had buried with my own hands 3 years ago. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It's 78, that happens sometimes. I put on my glasses and looked again. There he was, Richard, unmistakable with his crooked smile and that blue checkered shirt he loves so much. I zoomed in on the digital screen, my hands trembling. The photo was from our family reunion at Lake Tahoma, North Carolina. I remembered that day clearly. The children running around, the smell of barbecue, Richard complaining about the heat. But what I didn't remember was him standing there, behind the oak tree, watching us from a distance when he should have been right beside me in the foreground, holding little Danny. I scrolled through more photos from that day. In each one, Richard appeared twice, once beside me, laughing and talking with family, and again in the background, just watching, always with that same expression. My heart raced as I flipped through photo after photo. This couldn't be real. I called my son Michael immediately. "Mon, it's probably just someone who looks like Dad," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "You know how these old photos can be blurry." "No, Michael, it's him. I'd know your father anywhere." "Mom." His tone had that familiar ring to it, the one that said he was worried about my mental state. "Why don't you come stay with us for a few days?" I hung up, frustrated. Michael didn't understand. Nobody would. But I knew what I saw. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face in those photos. That smile that wasn't quite right. I got up and went to the attic to find the original photo albums. There had to be an explanation. The attic was dusty and filled with memories. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old toys, Richard's fishing gear that I couldn't bear to get rid of. And there, on the far shelf, the photo albums. I pulled down the one labeled 1972 and flipped through it with shaking hands. And that's when things got even stranger. The photos in the album didn't match what I had scanned. In these originals, there was only one Richard, the one beside me, where he should be. No figure watching from the background. No duplicate husband. Had I imagined it? Was Michael right about my mind playing tricks? I went back downstairs to check the digital frame again. The photos there still showed both Richards, one by my side, one lurking in the distance. Someone had altered these photos. But who? And why? And how did they get into my digital frame? I spent all night comparing the albums to the digital versions, finding more and more discrepancies. In every digital photo, there he was, my dead husband, watching from the background. The next morning, I called the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind, my oldest friend, Judith. She's known me for 60 years and would tell me straight if I was slipping. "Bring both the albums and that digital frame thing over," she said. "Let's get to the bottom of this." At Judith's house, we laid everything out on her dining room table. She examined each photo carefully, switching between the originals and the digital versions. "Vivian," she finally said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet, "these digital ones have definitely been altered, but it would take someone with real technical skills to do this. But who would do such a thing? And why?" Judith didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Who had access to your photos before they were loaded onto this frame?" "Only Michael. He took the albums last month to scan them for my birthday." Judith's expression changed just slightly. "And you're sure Richard is really gone?" I stared at her. "Judith, I identified his body. I watched them lower his casket into the ground. Of course he's gone." But as I drove home, a terrible thought began to form in my mind. What if what I saw in the morgue wasn't really Richard? What if there had been some mistake? No, that was impossible. I was letting my imagination run wild. When I got home, there was a voicemail from Michael. "Mom, I'm coming over tomorrow. We need to talk about Dad." A chill ran through me. What did Michael know about this? I was about to call him back when I noticed something on my kitchen table that made my blood freeze. A Polaroid photo that hadn't been there when I left. A new photo, taken today, showing my empty kitchen. And there in the corner, reflected in the microwave door, was Richard, watching. I looked up at the microwave. There was no reflection now, but I was no longer alone in this house. And I needed to find out why my dead husband was trying to tell me something. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing he might be watching? I sat in my living room chair with all the lights on, clutching my old aluminum baseball bat, the one I kept by my bed since Richard died. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside had me flinching. By morning, exhaustion had overtaken fear. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of my doorbell. Michael stood on the porch, looking worried. "Jesus, Mom," he said when I opened the door. "You look terrible." I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Michael, I need to know the truth about your father." His face changed. Just a flicker, but I caught it. Guilt. He knew something. "Let's sit down," he said, guiding me to the kitchen table. The Polaroid was gone. Had I imagined that too? Michael took a deep breath. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you about Dad. About the accident. 3 years ago, Richard had died in a car crash coming home from his weekly poker game. At least, that's what I was told. The car had caught fire and identification had been difficult. But I'd recognized his wedding ring, his watch I'd given Richard on our 30th anniversary. "It wasn't an accident," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart seemed to stop. "What are you saying?" "Dad was involved with some people. Dangerous people. He owed them money. A lot of money. The room seemed to tilt. Your father didn't gamble beyond his weekly game. He was a high school science teacher, for God's sakes." Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. "The poker games were just a cover. He was in deep with loan sharks. He'd been stealing from them." I shook my head. This couldn't be Richard, the man I'd been married to for 40 years. No, I would have known. He kept it from everyone, even me, until the end, when he needed help. Help with what? Michael looked at me, finally. Disappearing. The word hung in the air between us. Disappearing. Not dying. The body? It wasn't him? Michael shook his head. The FBI helped arrange it. Witness protection. The fire was convenient, made identification questionable. The personal items were planted. My mind raced back to the morgue, to that charred body I could barely look at. The coroner pointing out the wedding ring, the watch I'd given Richard on our 30th anniversary. All staged. You let me think he was dead for 3 years? My voice rose with each word. How could you? It was the only way to keep both of you safe. They would have killed him, and maybe you too. I couldn't risk losing both my parents. Where is he now? I demanded. Mom, I can't tell you that. It's for your own protection. I slammed my hand on the table. Don't you dare patronize me. Michael David Wilson, my husband, is alive, and you've been lying to me for 3 years. I deserve to know where he is. Michael flinched at my tone. He hadn't heard it since he was caught joyriding at 16. Arizona, he finally said. Or at least that's the last I heard. He moves around. And the photos? The ones you scanned? His brow furrowed. What about them? I grabbed the digital frame and showed him the images with Richard watching from the background. The color drained from Michael's face. Mom, I didn't do this. I scanned the original photos exactly as they were.
There was no second dad in them. Now it was my turn to be confused, but Judith and I both saw them. He's there in every one. Show me. I clicked through the photos again, but now they were normal. Just like the originals. No Richard watching from the shadows. I swear they were different yesterday. I insisted, feeling slightly crazed. Michael took my hand. Mom, maybe you should lie down. This is a lot to process. I pulled away. I'm not imagining things. I didn't say you were, but finding out Dad is alive after all this time, it's a shock. I let him guide me to the sofa, my mind spinning. Richard was alive, somewhere in Arizona, living a new life without me. And someone, or something, had altered those photos to let me know. But when Michael left, promising to return tomorrow, I checked the digital frame again. The double images were back. Richard watching from the background in every single photo. And now I understood. This wasn't some ghost or hallucination. Richard was trying to contact me. He was watching me right now. I looked up at the empty room. Richard, I said to the silent house, if you can hear me, I'm coming to find you. As if in response, the digital frame flickered, then showed a single image, not one I had scanned, a desert highway with a sign, "Welcome to Sedona."
I've never been impulsive. 60 years of teaching elementary school had instilled in me a habit of careful planning. But the next morning, I found myself booking a one-way ticket to Phoenix. I didn't tell Michael. I didn't tell anyone except Judith, who promised to feed my cat and gave me her niece's old smartphone in case you need to look anything up. The flight to Arizona was the first time I'd flown alone since Richard and I went to Hawaii for our 40th anniversary. As the plane descended over the red desert landscape, I wondered if I had lost my mind, chasing after a husband who had faked his death at my age? But the alternative, sitting at home, knowing Richard was out there somewhere, was unthinkable. I rented a car at the airport, a process that made me miss Richard's patient handling of such details. The young woman at the counter looked doubtful when I presented my license. "When was the last time you drove, ma'am?" "Yesterday," I said firmly, though it had actually been months. Richard had always preferred to drive. The GPS guided me out of Phoenix and toward Sedona. 2 hours later, I pulled into a modest motel on the outskirts of town. My back ached and doubts had begun to creep in. How exactly did I plan to find one man in an entire city? A man who didn't want to be found. In my room, I unpacked the few things I'd brought: clothes, medications, and the digital picture frame. I plugged it in, hoping for another clue. For hours, nothing happened, just the same altered photos cycling through. I was about to give up when the frame flickered again, then showed a new image, a diner called Red Rock Cafe, with a street address visible on its awning. My heart pounded. This was real. Richard was communicating with me. The next morning, I found the diner easily, a small place with large windows offering views of the stunning red cliffs surrounding Sedona. I took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee, and waited. For what, I wasn't sure. An hour passed, then another. The waitress, Darlene, according to her name tag, kept refilling my cup with increasingly concerned looks. "Waiting for someone, honey?" "My husband," I replied, then added, "We're meeting here." Darlene smiled. "Well, men are always late, aren't they? Even after 50 years, my Earl can't tell time worth a damn." I smiled back, grateful for the casual conversation. "How did you know I've been married that long?" "Oh, I can always tell the long-timers. There's a certain patience you develop." She leaned closer.
Plus, you've been twisting your wedding ring for the past 2 hours. I looked down at my hands, surprised. I was still wearing my wedding ring even after 3 years of believing I was a widow. What's his name? Your husband? Richard. Richard Wilson. The name felt strange on my tongue after so long. Darlene's expression changed, just slightly. Recognition. You know him, I said, not a question. She hesitated. I shouldn't. Please, I said, taking her hand. I've come all the way from North Carolina. It's important. Darlene sighed. He comes in every Tuesday and Friday morning, sits in that booth by the window, orders the same thing, Denver omelet, no toast, extra tomatoes. Richard's favorite breakfast, exactly as he'd always ordered it. Is he alone? Always. Keeps to himself, but he's polite, tips well. She paused. He calls himself Robert now. Robert Webster. Robert Webster. My maiden name. When will he be here next? Tomorrow, Friday. Usually comes in around 8:30. I thanked her, left a generous tip, and went back to my motel. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with questions. What would I say to him? Would he be angry that I'd found him? Would he even acknowledge me? Friday morning, I arrived at the diner at 8 a.m. and took a seat in a booth with a view of the entrance. I had dressed carefully in the blue dress Richard had always liked, applied makeup for the first time in months, even put on the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. At exactly 8:27, the bell above the door jingled, and there he was. Richard, my husband, alive. He looked older, thinner. His hair had gone completely white, and he wore glasses I didn't recognize. But it was him, the way he moved, the slight hunch of his shoulders, unmistakable. He didn't see me at first, heading straight for his usual booth. Darlene caught his eye and subtly nodded in my direction. Richard turned. Our eyes met across the diner. His widened in shock, color draining from his face. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he walked to my booth and slid in across from me. "Vivian," he said, his voice exactly as I remembered it. "You came here. How did you find me?" I took a deep breath. "You led me here, Richard, through the photos." Confusion crossed his face. "What photos?" Before I could explain, he reached across the table and took my hands in his. They felt the same. Those long fingers, the callus on his right thumb from years of grading papers. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "It's not safe." "I don't care," I said, surprised by my own fierceness. "You let me think you were dead." Pain flashed in his eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." Is there someone else?" "No," he said quickly. "There could never be. You're my wife, the only woman I've ever loved." For the first time since seeing those altered photos, I felt something besides fear or anger. Hope. "Then come home," I said. "Whatever trouble you're in, we'll face it together, like we always have." Richard opened his mouth to reply, but his gaze suddenly shifted to something over my shoulder. His expression changed to one of pure terror. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." I turned to look. Through the window, I saw a black SUV pulling up outside the diner. 2 men in dark suits emerged. "The back door," Richard said, pulling me up. "Quickly." As we rushed through the kitchen, ignoring the startled cooks, I realized with sudden clarity that whatever danger Richard had been hiding from was now a danger to us both, and I had led them straight to him.
Richard gripped my hand tightly as we ran through the alley behind the diner. Despite his age, he moved with the urgency of a much younger man, pulling me along when I struggled to keep up. "My car," I gasped. "It's in the lot." "We can't risk it," he said. "They might be watching it already." He led me to an old blue pickup truck parked behind a neighboring store. To my surprise, he pulled out keys and unlocked it. "You have a truck?" "Get in," was his only response. As we pulled away, I caught sight of the two men from the SUV entering the back of the diner. Richard drove with tense concentration, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. "Who are they, Richard?" "Collectors," he said grimly. "They work for a man named Vance. I owed him money, and when I couldn't pay, I borrowed it from his safe. It was stupid. But my student was in trouble. They were going to hurt his family." "How much did you take?" $200,000. I gasped. "Richard!" I know, but I had a plan to put it back. There was this investment opportunity. It doesn't matter. It fell through, and then they were coming after me." We drove into the desert, the red rock formations of Sedona growing smaller behind us. Eventually, Richard turned onto a dirt road that wound up into the hills. After about 15 minutes, a small cabin came into view, partially hidden among pine trees. "This is where you've been living?" I asked as we went inside. It was sparse. Just one room with a kitchenette, a bed, a small table with a laptop, and bookshelves overflowing with paperbacks. So different from our cozy colonial in Charlotte. "It's not much," Richard admitted, "but it's been manageable." "For 3 years?" I said, the reality of his choice still stinging. "Well, I thought you were dead." Richard sank on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking every one of his 76 years. "I never wanted this, Viv. The FBI said it was the only way. Make a clean break, let everyone believe I was gone. Vance would stop looking, and you'd be safe." "The FBI? Michael mentioned them too. Are you some kind of informant?" He nodded. "They've been building a case against Vance for years. They needed my testimony. And the photos, the ones on my digital frame." Richard looked genuinely confused. "I don't know anything about that." I pulled out my phone, Judith's niece's phone, and showed him the pictures I had taken of the altered images. Richard stared at them bewildered. "This wasn't me, Viv, I swear." "Then who? Who else knew you were alive?" "Just Michael and the FBI agents assigned to my case." He paused. "Agent Delgado is my handler. He checks in every week." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. When was he supposed to check in next? Yesterday. He didn't show. The implications hung in the air between us. If Richard's FBI handler had disappeared, as if reading my thoughts, Richard stood up. "We need to call him now." He pulled out a prepaid cell phone from a drawer and dialed. After a moment, his face grew more concerned. "Voicemail. That's not like him." "Richard," I said slowly, "how did those men know to look for you at the diner?" He shook his head. "I don't know. I've been careful. Same routine for 3 years, no contact with anyone from my old life, except Michael, and even that was through Delgado." A horrible thought occurred to me. My phone! The one Judith's niece gave me. What if it's being tracked? Richard's eyes widened. "Give it to me." He took the phone, removed the battery, and placed both under a cast iron skillet on the stove. "That won't block the signal completely, but it might help," he said. "We need to move. They could be already on their way." "Where can we go?" "I have a backup location. Another cabin, about 3 hours north, more remote." As Richard quickly packed a small bag, I noticed a framed photo on his bedside cable, the only personal item in the sparse room. It was us,
on our 45th anniversary, standing on the beach in Maui. I was wearing a flowered sundress, and Richard had his arm around my waist. We looked happy. "You kept this," I said, picking up the frame. Richard paused in his packing. "Of course I did. It was all I had of you." Something about his words struck me as odd. "Richard, if you were trying to disappear completely, why keep a photo that could identify you?" Before he could answer, the sound of tires on gravel came from outside. Richard moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "Black SUV. We're too late." He grabbed my hand and led me to what looked like a closet door. Inside was a small space with an old metal trapdoor in the floor. "Root cellar," he explained, lifting the door to reveal a ladder. "It used to be for storing preserves. It connects to a drainage pipe that comes out about 100 yards down the hill. Go down, follow the pipe until you see daylight, then head east toward the rising sun. There's a ranger station about 2 miles that way." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. I just need to grab something first." I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. The same look he had when he told me everything would be fine after his cancer diagnosis 10 years ago. "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly. "Vivian, please." A loud bang interrupted him. Someone pounding on the front door. "Webster, we know you're in there. Come out and maybe we don't hurt the old lady." Richard's face went pale. "How do they know about you?" Another horrible realization hit me. "The diner, the waitress, Darlene. She recognized your name when I mentioned it." "Darlene?" Richard looked confused. "She's worked there for years. She's always been kind to me." "Kind enough to earn your trust," I said. "What if she's been watching you for them all along, waiting for you to make contact with someone from your old life?" The pounding came again, more insistent. "Last chance, Webster. We just want to talk." Richard's expression hardened. "Get in the cellar, Viv, please." "Not without you." He cupped my face in his hands, looking into my eyes with an intensity that took my breath away. "I lost you once already. I can't let anything happen to you now. Please, my love, go." Before I could argue further, the front door burst open. 2 men entered, the same ones from the diner. One held a gun. "Well, well," said the one without the gun, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking suit. "Richard Wilson, you've been a hard man to find." "Vance," Richard said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "I wondered if you'd come yourself." Vance, the man Richard had stolen from, the man he had been hiding from for 3 years. "You know why I'm here," Vance said. "The money plus interest, and maybe a finger or two for the trouble you've caused me." "I told you, I don't have your money." Vance sighed dramatically. "That's disappointing, Richard, especially with your lovely wife here now, too. What was your name again, ma'am? Vivian, wasn't it?" My blood ran cold. He knew my name. This wasn't a coincidence or a lucky break for them. They'd been watching, waiting. "The pictures," I whispered. Vance smiled coldly. "Technology is remarkable these days. A little Photoshop, a little hacking into your home network. You'd be surprised what money can buy." "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice tight. "I told you, my money. With 3 years of interest, let's call it $500,000. "I told you I don't have it." Vance nodded to the man with the gun, who stepped forward and pressed the barrel to my temple. I froze, terror washing through me. "I think you will find a way," Vance said calmly. "You have 48 hours. Just then, a sound came from outside, car door slamming, voices calling out. Vance looked alarmed for the first time. "Company?" asked Richard. A voice called through a megaphone from outside. "FBI! The house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Richard's relief flooded his face. "Delgado," he whispered. What happened next was a blur. Vance's man swung the gun toward the door. Richard lunged at him. There was a struggle, a deafening bang, and Richard fell to the floor with a red stain spreading across his chest. I screamed, dropping to my knees beside him as FBI agents stormed into the cabin, subduing Vance and his associates. But I barely noticed. All I could see was Richard, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on my face. "Viv, I'm sorry." "Don't talk," I said, pressing my hands to his wound. "Help is coming." He smiled weakly, always looking after me. "Richard, please stay with me. We've only just found each other again." His hand found mine, squeezing with surprising strength. "Best 50 years of my life." And as agents shouted for paramedics, as the room filled with chaos around us, I held my husband's hand and prayed that our story wasn't ending just as it had begun again.
The hospital waiting room in Sedona was small, just 10 chairs and a coffee machine that made terrible coffee. I'd been sitting there for 5 hours, my clothes still stained with Richard's blood. Agent Delgado sat beside me, a serious young man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely concerned about Richard. He'd been explaining everything, how they'd been building a case against Vance for years, how Richard's testimony was crucial. "When we missed our check-in, I knew something was wrong," he said. "Then we intercepted communications that Vance himself was heading to Sedona. We got here as fast as we could." "Not fast enough," I said, the words sharper than I'd intended. Delgado didn't flinch. "No, not fast enough. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson." We fell silent again, waiting for news. Michael was on his way, catching the first flight from Charlotte. I still hadn't decided if I would forgive him for his part in this deception. Finally, a doctor appeared, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and surgical scrubs. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, approaching me, "your husband is out of surgery." "Is he—" I couldn't finish the question. "He's stable. The bullet missed his heart, but damaged his left lung and nicked an artery. He lost a lot of blood, and at his age, recovery will be challenging, but he's fighting." Relief made my knees weak. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now. Once we move him to ICU, you can visit briefly." 2 more hours passed before a nurse came to escort me to Richard's room. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight of him. My strong, vibrant husband lying unconscious, connected to tubes and monitors, his face ashen beneath the breathing mask. I took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV. "I'm here, Richard," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Whether it was my imagination or not, I thought I felt a slight pressure as his fingers twitched against mine. For 3 days, I barely left his side. Michael arrived, tearful and apologetic. I couldn't bring myself to discuss his deception yet. Instead, we took shifts sitting with Richard, who drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 4th day, Richard opened his eyes while I was alone with him, reading aloud from one of his favorite mystery novels. "Viv?" His voice was barely audible, raspy from the breathing tube that had been removed the day before. I set the book down, reaching for his hand. "I'm here." "Not a dream," he murmured. "No, not a dream. I'm really here." Tears filled my eyes. "You gave me quite a scare, Richard Wilson." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Sorry about that." "You should be. Faking your death, hiding in Arizona, getting yourself shot. You've put me through quite an ordeal." His eyes, though clouded with pain, held mine. "Worth it, to see you again." I leaned forward, gently kissing his forehead. "You don't dare leave me again, you hear? Not after I've come all this way to find you." He nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "Promise." The next few weeks were a roller coaster. Richard developed pneumonia, a common but dangerous complication after chest surgery, especially for someone his age.
There were nights when I sat beside his bed, listening to his labored breathing, terrified that after finding him again, I might truly lose him this time. But Richard was stubborn, always had been. Slowly, he improved. The doctor spoke cautiously of recovery, of rehabilitation. Agent Delgado visited regularly, updating us on the case against Vance. They had more than enough evidence now, he assured us. Vance would be going away for a long time. Richard would need to testify eventually, but that was months away. What happens then? I asked one afternoon as Richard slept. That depends, Delgado said. Witness protection is still an option. New identities, a new location. Together this time, I said firmly. Wherever he goes, I go. Delgado nodded. Of course. Though it might not be necessary. Once Vance is convicted, the immediate threat should be neutralized. Should be? I raised an eyebrow. There are always associates, family members, but with proper precautions, you might be able to resume something close to your old lives. Something close to our old lives. I looked at Richard, sleeping fitfully, his body still struggling to heal. Could we ever go back to what we had? Did we even want to? 6 weeks after the shooting, Richard was discharged from the hospital. He was still weak, requiring regular physical therapy and nursing care. The FBI had arranged a safe house for us, a small ranch-style home on the outskirts of Sedona, with security systems and regular patrols. Michael had returned to Charlotte weeks earlier, his technology company needing his attention, but he called daily, still walking on eggshells around me. I wasn't ready to fully forgive him yet, but I was trying to understand. He'd been caught between protecting his father and lying to his mother, an impossible position. One evening, as Richard and I sat on the patio, watching the sunset paint the red rocks in even deeper crimson, he took my hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice stronger now, though still not the robust tone I remembered, "about what happens next. What do you want to happen?"
I want to go home, Richard said simply. Not to Charlotte, that life is gone, but maybe somewhere new, where we can be together without looking over our shoulders. What about the trial? Vance's people? Delgado thinks we could settle in a smaller town, maybe on the West Coast. Not witness protection exactly, but a fresh start with some basic security precautions. He squeezed my hand. It wouldn't be the retirement we planned, but we'd be together, I finished. That's all that matters to me. Richard's eyes filled with tears. After everything I've put you through, you'd still start over with me? Richard Wilson, I've spent 53 years with you. I'm not about to stop now just because you made one spectacularly bad decision. I managed a small smile. Even if that decision involved faking your death. He looked away, guilt washing over his face. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Viv. You'd better. Though I must admit, there is something thrilling about being married to a man with a secret identity. Very James Bond. Richard laughed, then winced, holding his chest. Please don't make me laugh yet. It hurts too much. That night, as Richard slept beside me, a miracle I still couldn't quite believe, I thought about the strange path that had led us here. The altered photos, my cross-country journey, the terrible fear of losing him all over again. Part of me was still angry at the deception, the years of grief I'd endured unnecessarily. But another part understood the impossible choice Richard had faced. In the morning, I called Michael. "Mom," he answered immediately, "is Dad okay?" "Your father is fine," I said, "but it's time you and I had a real conversation." There was a pause. "About me not telling you he was alive?" "Yes." Michael sighed heavily. "I wanted to tell you, Mom. Every day for 3 years I wanted to tell you. Seeing you grieving, putting flowers on an empty grave, it was torture." "Then why didn't you?"
Because Dad made me promise, and because the FBI agents made it very clear what could happen if Vance found out Dad was alive. They showed me photos of what happened to other witnesses who'd been discovered. His voice cracked. I couldn't risk that happening to either of you. I closed my eyes, picturing my son carrying this burden alone. We should have faced it together, as a family. I know that now, Michael said quietly. Can you ever forgive me? The question hung in the air. Could I? The anger was still there, but diminishing in the face of understanding. I'm working on it, I said finally. We all made choices, Michael. Your father chose to protect me by disappearing. You chose to protect us both by keeping his secret. And I chose to find him, despite the risks. Now we have new choices to make. Together this time. Over the next month, Richard's strength returned gradually. We spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of our 3 years apart. I told him about the grief support group I'd joined, the garden I'd planted in his memory. He told me about his solitary life in the cabin, teaching online science courses under his new identity, the way he'd watch our old home through social media posts from neighbors. He saw the Christmas lights you put up last year, the blue ones on the porch. They looked beautiful. You were spying on me? I asked, not sure whether to be touched or disturbed. Just checking that you were okay, he admitted. I never commented or connected, just watched from afar. Like in the altered photos, I thought, with a chill. Maybe Vance's people hadn't created those images after all. Maybe they'd simply noticed Richard's digital footprints as he watched over me and used that knowledge to set their trap. 2 months after the shooting, Vance's trial was scheduled. Richard would testify, then we would relocate. Monterey, California was the current plan, a coastal town where 2 retirees could blend in easily. The night before we were set to fly to New York for the trial, Richard and I sat looking through old photo albums. The real ones this time. No digital alterations. Remember this day? He asked, pointing to a picture of us on a boat, both of us laughing as spray from the lake showered us. Lake Norman, 1987. Danny fell overboard trying to catch that huge bass, and you jumped in after him even though he was 16 and a better swimmer than you. Richard smiled. I was terrified. All I could think was, not my son. You've always been protective of the people you love, sometimes to a fault. He looked at me, understanding my reference to his disappearance. I thought I was doing the right thing, Viv. I couldn't bear the thought of them hurting you to get to me. I know. I turned the page of the album, revealing our family Christmas photo from 2010. Richard, me, Michael, his wife Sarah, and young Danny Jr., all smiling, unaware of what the future would hold. But we're stronger together than apart. Always have been, always will be, he agreed, taking my hand. The next morning, as we prepared to leave for the airport, Agent Delgado arrived unexpectedly at our safe house. There's been a development, he said, his expression grave. Vance was found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide. Richard sank into a chair. Suicide? That doesn't sound like Vance. We're investigating, but without him, the case against his organization is significantly weaker. What does this mean for us? I asked. It's complicated, Delgado admitted. On the one hand, the immediate threat, Vance himself, is gone. On the other, his organization is still operational, and someone new will step up to lead it. They might decide to let bygones be bygones, or they might want revenge, Richard finished. We still recommend relocation and new identities, at least temporarily. I looked at Richard, seeing the weariness in his eyes. More hiding, more looking over our shoulders, more fear. No, I said firmly.
Both men turned to me, surprised. No more running, I continued. We've spent 3 years apart because of these people. I won't let them dictate the rest of our lives, too. Vivian, Richard began. "It's not safe." "Nowhere is completely safe," I interrupted. "But I'd rather face whatever comes together than spend another day hiding from shadows." Agent Delgado looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Wilson, I strongly advise against—" "What if we went public?" Richard suggested suddenly. "Public?" Delgado and I asked simultaneously. "The whole story, my testimony against Vance, the witness protection, all of it. Give it to the media. Make it so high profile that coming after us would only bring more attention to their organization." Delgado frowned. "That's unorthodox." "But it might work," I said, warming to the idea. "If everyone knows Richard's story, if it's in the national news, wouldn't that provide a kind of protection?" "Or make you an even bigger target," Delgado countered. "At least we'd be living on our terms, not theirs," Richard said. The conversation continued for hours, with Delgado calling in his superiors. By evening, a compromise had been reached. Richard would give one major interview with a trusted journalist, telling a version of his story that protected sensitive details of the investigation. We would relocate temporarily, but with the option to return to a more normal life after 6 months if the situation remained stable. 2 weeks later, we sat in a hotel suite in Washington, D.C., facing a veteran reporter from a major news network. Richard held my hand tightly as he told our story, the modified version approved by the FBI. "I faked my death to protect my family. It was the hardest decision I've ever made. But not a day went by that I didn't think of my wife, my son, the life I left behind." The reporter turned to me. "And how did you feel when you discovered your husband was alive, Mrs. Wilson?" I considered the question carefully. Shocked, angry, relieved, all at once. But mostly I felt determined to never be separated again. "And now, what happens next for you both?" Richard and I exchanged glances. "We start over," I said simply. "Together." The interview aired nationally the following week. As predicted, it created a sensation. Richard's story, the devoted teacher who went into hiding to protect his family, captured the public's imagination. We received thousands of messages of support, offers of places to stay, even a book deal. More importantly, according to Delgado, chatter within Vance's organization suggested they had no appetite for pursuing a vendetta that would bring further scrutiny to their organization. The new leadership was more interested in distancing themselves from Vance's more controversial operations. 6 months later, as agreed, we revisited our security situation. With no signs of threat, we made another decision: to return to North Carolina, not to Charlotte, but to a small coastal town where neither of us had connections. We bought a modest house 2 blocks from the ocean with a porch swing and a garden for me to tend. Michael and his family visited regularly. Danny Jr., now 13, was initially wary of the grandfather who had returned from the dead, but Richard's patience and genuine interest in the boy's science projects gradually won him over. Life settled into a new normal. Richard couldn't return to teaching in a classroom. He was too recognizable now. But he found purpose volunteering at the local science museum, inspiring a new generation of curious minds. As for me, I started a support group for older adults facing major life transitions. I never shared the full details of my own story, but the experience of losing and finding Richard had given me insights into resilience that seemed to help others. One evening, a year after the interview, Richard and I walked along the beach at sunset. Despite the lingering effects of his injury, a slight limp, occasional shortness of breath, he moved with a lightness I hadn't seen since before his death. "Happy?" he asked, noticing my thoughtful expression. "Very," I replied, "though sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that you're really here." Richard stopped walking, turning to face me. "I'm here, Viv, for good this time."
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, not my original wedding band, which I still wore, but a new one with small sapphires surrounding a diamond. "I missed our 50th anniversary," he said softly, "and our 51st and 52nd. I can't get those years back, but I can promise you all the ones we have left." He took my hand. "Vivian Elizabeth Wilson, will you marry me again?" Tears filled my eyes as I looked at this man I'd loved for over half a century, this man I'd grieved, found, and nearly lost again. "Yes," I said, "always yes." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Richard slipped the new ring onto my finger next to the old one, the past and present, side by side, just like us. That night I dreamed of photos, not the altered ones that had led me to Richard, but new ones we'd create together, images of a future I'd once thought impossible, a second chance at the life we were meant to share. And in the morning, when I woke to find Richard beside me, I said a silent prayer of gratitude for the mysterious stranger in the photographs who had turned out to be my husband all along.
Both men turned to me, surprised. "No more running," I continued. "We've spent 3 years apart because of these people. I won't let them dictate the rest of our lives, too." "Vivian," Richard began, "it's not safe." "Nowhere is completely safe," I interrupted. "But I'd rather face whatever comes together than spend another day hiding from shadows." Agent Delgado looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Wilson, I strongly advise against—" "What if we went public?" Richard suggested suddenly. "Public?" Delgado and I asked simultaneously. "The whole story, my testimony against Vance, the witness protection, all of it. Give it to the media. Make it so high profile that coming after us would only bring more attention to their organization." Delgado frowned. "That's unorthodox." "But it might work," I said, warming to the idea. "If everyone knows Richard's story, if it's in the national news, wouldn't that provide a kind of protection?" "Or make you an even bigger target," Delgado countered. "At least we be living on our terms, not theirs," Richard said. The conversation continued for hours, with Delgado calling in his superiors. By evening, a compromise had been reached. Richard would give one major interview with a trusted journalist, telling a version of his story that protected sensitive details of the investigation. We would relocate temporarily, but with the option to return to a more normal life after 6 months if the situation remained stable. 2 weeks later, we sat in a hotel suite in Washington, D.C., facing a veteran reporter from a major news network. Richard held my hand tightly as he told our story, the modified version approved by the FBI. "I faked my death to protect my family. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but not a day went by that I didn't think of my wife, my son, the life I left behind." The reporter turned to me. "And how did you feel when you discovered your husband was alive, Mrs. Wilson?" I considered the question carefully. Shocked, angry, relieved, all at once. But mostly I felt determined to never be separated again. "And now, what happens next for you both?" Richard and I exchanged glances. "We start over," I said simply. "Together." The interview aired nationally the following week. As predicted, it created a sensation. Richard's story, the devoted teacher who went into hiding to protect his family, captured the public's imagination. We received thousands of messages of support, offers of places to stay, even a book deal. More importantly, according to Delgado, chatter within Vance's organization suggested they had no appetite for pursuing a vendetta that would bring further scrutiny to their organization. The new leadership was more interested in distancing themselves from Vance's more controversial operations. 6 months later, as agreed, we revisited our security situation. With no signs of threat, we made another decision to return to North Carolina, not to Charlotte, but to a small coastal town where neither of us had connections. We bought a modest house 2 blocks from the ocean with a porch swing and a garden for me to tend. Michael and his family visited regularly. Danny Jr., now 13, was initially wary of the grandfather who had returned from the dead, but Richard's patience and genuine interest in the boy's science projects gradually won him over. Life settled into a new normal. Richard couldn't return to teaching in a classroom. He was too recognizable now, but he found purpose volunteering at the local science museum, inspiring a new generation of curious minds. As for me, I started a support group for older adults facing major life transitions. I never shared the full details of my own story, but the experience of losing and finding Richard had given me insights into resilience that seemed to help others. One evening, a year after the interview, Richard and I walked along the beach at sunset. Despite the lingering effects of his injury, a slight limp, occasional shortness of breath, he moved with a lightness I hadn't seen since before his death. "Happy?" he asked, noticing my thoughtful expression. "Very," I replied, "though sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that you're really here." Richard stopped walking, turning to face me. "I'm here, Viv, for good this time." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, not my original wedding band, which I still wore, but a new one with small sapphires surrounding a diamond. "I missed our 50th anniversary," he said softly, "and our 51st and 52nd. I can't get those years back, but I can promise you all the ones we have left." He took my hand. "Vivian Elizabeth Wilson, will you marry me again?" Tears filled my eyes as I looked at this man I'd loved for over half a century, this man I'd grieved, found, and nearly lost again. "Yes," I said, "always yes." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Richard slipped the new ring onto my finger next to the old one, the past and present, side by side, just like us. That night I dreamed of photos, not the altered ones that had led me to Richard, but new ones we'd create together, images of a future I'd once thought impossible, a second chance at the life we were meant to share. And in the morning, when I woke to find Richard beside me, I said a silent prayer of gratitude for the mysterious stranger in the photographs who had turned out to be my husband all along.
Back in our coastal home after the holidays, we settled into a new rhythm. The foundation work kept us busy. Richard's health continued to improve. We traveled, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Alaska, where we watched the northern lights dance across the sky. Hawaii, returning to the beach where we'd celebrated our 45th anniversary. Time, which had once seemed so cruelly truncated by Richard's death, now stretched before us like a gift. Finite, yes, but no longer stolen from us. On what would have been, was, our 55th wedding anniversary, Richard surprised me with a small party. Michael and his family drove down from Charlotte. A few new friends from town joined us. There was cake, champagne, stories shared. As the evening wound down, Richard raised his glass for a toast. "To my wife, Vivian," he said, his voice strong and clear, "who found me when I was lost, who forgave me when I was wrong, who loved me enough to cross deserts and face dangers to bring me home." He turned to me, his eyes shining with emotion. "They say true love never dies, but what they don't tell you is how hard you sometimes have to fight to keep it alive, how many obstacles you have to overcome." I reached for his hand, remembering everything we'd endured,
The separation, the deception, the shooting, the painful feeling. We fought, I said simply, and we won. Later that night, after our guests had gone and we sat alone on our porch, watching stars appear over the ocean, Richard pulled out a small box. "Another ring?" I teased. "My fingers will run out of room." He laughed. "Not a ring this time." Inside was a small silver pendant in the shape of a frame, and inside the frame was a miniature version of our wedding photo. Richard in his too large rented suit, me in my mother's altered wedding dress, both of us impossibly young and hopeful. "To replace the photos that were altered," he explained as he fastened it around my neck. "A true image to carry with you. No manipulations, no deceptions, just us, as we began." I touched the pendant, feeling the weight of it against my skin. "It's perfect." "I can't change the past, Viv," Richard said softly. "I can't give you back those 3 years, but I can promise you all the days we have left. No more secrets, no more separations." "No more faking your death?" I asked with a small smile. "Definitely not. Once was quite enough." I leaned against his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound I had once thought I would never hear again. "Do you think we would have found each other again if Vance's people hadn't used those altered photos to lure me to Arizona?" I asked. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I like to think so. That somehow, some way, we would have reconnected. That some force in the universe couldn't bear to keep us apart. A romantic notion for a science teacher. Well, I've learned that some things can't be explained by science. Like how you found the strength to track me down. Like how I survived that shooting when the odds were against me. Like how after everything, we're sitting here together, watching the same stars." We fell silent, content in each other's company. The night was warm, the sound of waves breaking on the shore, a gentle backdrop to our thoughts. "The stranger in the photographs, he turned out to be the man I've known all along." Richard smiled, squeezing my hand. "Not a stranger after all. Just lost for a while." "But found," I said firmly. "Always found." And as we sat together, I thought about how life rarely gives us neat endings. Instead, it offers continuations, new chapters, unexpected turns in a story we thought we knew. Richard and I had been given something few people experience, the chance to lose and find each other, to grieve and rejoice, to end and begin again. It wasn't the life we had planned, but sitting there under the stars, his hand in mine, I knew it was the life we were meant to have. Our story, complicated, imperfect, and entirely our own. Spring arrived with a profusion of wildflowers in the small garden I'd planted behind our house. Richard had built me a bench beneath the flowering dogwood tree, and I often sat there in the mornings, coffee in hand, watching butterflies flit among the blooms. On one such morning, I was surprised to see Danny Jr. walking up our garden path. At 14, he had shot up in height, all gangly limbs and uncertainty. "Danny, what are you doing here?" I exclaimed, rising to embrace him. "Does your father know you're here?" He nodded. "Dad dropped me off. He's running errands in town. I wanted to talk to Grandpa. Is he here?" "In his workshop," I said, gesturing toward the converted garage where Richard spent hours tinkering with old radios and building model airplanes. "He'll be thrilled to see you." Danny hesitated. "Actually, Grandma, could you come too? I want to talk to both of you." Curious, I followed him to the workshop. Richard looked up from his workbench, surprise and delight spreading across his face. "Danny, what a wonderful surprise!" After greetings and hugs, Danny perched nervously on a stool, fidgeting with a screwdriver from Richard's bench. "I have a school assignment. We're supposed to interview someone who's lived through something extraordinary and write an essay about resilience." Richard and I exchanged glances. "And you want to interview us?" I asked gently. Danny nodded. "If that's okay, about, everything that happened, with Grandpa disappearing and you finding him." Richard seemed hesitant. "Danny, that's a complicated story with some pretty adult themes. Are you sure that's appropriate for school?" "We don't have to include all the details about the bad guys and stuff, just the core of it. How you had to pretend to be dead to protect everyone, and how Grandma never gave up on finding the truth." He looked at us earnestly. "It's the most amazing story I know." Something in his expression, so open, so sincere, touched my heart. Our story, which had begun as a tragedy and become a media sensation, was also our grandson's inheritance, a tale of love and perseverance that might shape his understanding of what was possible in life. "I think it's a wonderful idea," I said, surprising both Danny and Richard. "But your grandfather and I need to talk about how much is appropriate to share. Maybe we can all have lunch and discuss it." Over sandwiches on the patio, we navigated the complex terrain of our story, deciding which elements were suitable for a 14-year-old school project and which were better left untold for now. Danny took notes, occasionally asking questions that revealed a maturity beyond his years. "Were you ever angry at Grandpa for making you think he was dead?" I considered the question carefully. Yes, I admitted, I was angry. I felt betrayed, even after I understood why he did it. "But you forgave him," Danny stated, more observation than question. "I did, because when you love someone for as long as I've loved your grandfather, forgiveness becomes part of the foundation of your relationship. Not forgetting, not pretending the hurt didn't happen, but choosing to move forward together despite it." Danny wrote something down, then turned to Richard. "And were you ever mad at Dad for not telling Grandma the truth?" Richard looked startled by the question. It wasn't one we'd discussed in our many conversations about the past. "Yes, sometimes," he admitted. "There were moments when I thought that Michael should have found a way to tell your grandmother to spare her the grief. But I had put him in an impossible position. He was trying to protect both of us the best way he knew how." Danny seemed satisfied with this answer, though I made a mental note to revisit the topic with Richard later. It hadn't occurred to me that he might have harbored resentment toward our son. After lunch, as Michael arrived to pick up Danny, our grandson surprised us with a request. "Could I maybe have a photo of you two for my presentation? Not an old one, but like now?" Richard put his arm around my shoulders as Michael took a picture of us on the patio, the flowering dogwood visible in the background. It struck me that this image, two elderly people with lined faces and white hair, arms around each other, contained a story no viewer could possibly grasp just by looking. The depth of our experiences, the years of separation and reunion, the fight to reclaim our life together, all invisible, yet forming the foundation of the simple moment captured in the photograph. That evening, as Michael and Danny had left, Richard and I sat on our porch swing watching the sunset. "I never asked if you were angry at Michael," I said quietly. Richard sighed. "Not angry, exactly. Frustrated sometimes. I'd call to check in, and he'd tell me how you were struggling, and I'd think, just tell her I'm alive. But I knew that wasn't fair to him.
I had sworn him to secrecy, made him promise. He was caught in the middle, I agreed, trying to be a good son to both of us. We sat in contemplative silence for a while. Danny's question got me thinking, Richard said eventually, about forgiveness. It's been a major theme in our story, hasn't it? You forgiving me, both of us forgiving Michael. Maybe even forgiving ourselves. I nodded, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Forgiveness isn't something you do once and it's done. It's a choice you keep making. Do you still have moments? Richard asked hesitantly. When you're angry about those 3 years? I considered the question honestly. Yes, sometimes. Not often, but yes. Usually when I think about what I missed, your 70th birthday, Michael's promotion ceremony, moments we should have shared. Richard took my hand. I'm sorry, Viv. I'll always be sorry for that. I know, I squeezed his hand, and I'll always choose to forgive you. That night, as I drifted towards sleep, I thought about Danny's essay. What would he write about us? What lessons would he take from our complicated journey? And what would readers of his essay, his teacher, his classmates, make of our story filtered through the perspective of a 14-year-old boy? It was a strange feeling knowing that our private pain and joy would become part of someone else's understanding of the world, but perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps our experiences, shared thoughtfully, could help others navigate their own challenges.
2 weeks later, Danny called, his voice excited. I got an A on my essay, and Mrs. Peterson wants me to submit it to a national student writing contest. That's wonderful, Danny, I said, genuinely pleased. What did your classmates think? They had tons of questions about you and Grandpa, about what it was like when you found out he was alive. Some of them thought it was like a movie. He paused. Is it okay if I email you a copy? I want you and Grandpa to read it. That evening, Richard and I sat side by side at our small desk, reading Danny's essay on his laptop screen. The title made me catch my breath. The Strangers in the Photographs, My Grandparents' Second Chance. Danny had woven together the facts we'd shared with his own observations and insights. He wrote about how people can become strangers to each other through secrets, separation, or change, and how love can help them rediscover each other. He described Richard's choice to disappear as both heroic and flawed, my search for the truth as both desperate and determined. Most surprisingly, he wrote about his own feelings, the confusion of learning his grandfather wasn't really dead, the initial distance he'd felt toward this stranger who had returned to their family, and the gradual process of building a relationship with Richard anew. When my grandfather died, Danny wrote in his conclusion, our family lost more than just him. We lost trust in each other because of the secrets we kept. When he came back, we had to learn how to be a family again. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen right away. But watching my grandparents rebuild their relationship showed me that second chances are possible, even after the worst things happen. They became new people to each other, but they chose to love those new people just as much as they'd loved who they were before. By the time we finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. Richard put his arm around me, his own eyes damp. Out of the mouths of babes, he murmured. I said, he understood. He really understood what we went through, what we're still going through. He has your perceptiveness, he said with a small smile, and my scientific curiosity. Dangerous combination. I laughed through my tears. The next generation, carrying our story forward.
That night, I dreamed of photographs. Not the altered ones that had led me to Richard, not our wedding portrait or family snapshots, but images yet to be taken. Danny graduating high school, then college, a career, perhaps a family of his own, and Richard and I growing older, but still together, still part of the unfolding story of our family. In the morning, I woke to find Richard already up, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at something in his hands. It was the small pendant he'd given me, with our wedding photo inside the frame. "What are you thinking?" I asked, sitting up. "About time," he said thoughtfully, "how it stretches and compresses, how 55 years can feel both endless and too short." He looked at me, his eyes soft with emotion. "And how grateful I am for every moment we have now." I took the pendant from him, closed it gently, and placed it back around my neck, where it belonged. "Not strangers after all," I said, "just travelers who lost and found our way back to each other." Richard leaned forward and kissed me gently, and the journey continues. Outside our window, the morning sun illuminated the flowering dogwood in our garden, its white blossoms glowing against the blue spring sky. Another day in our second chance at life together. Another photograph waiting to be taken, another memory to create, another chapter in our extraordinary, ordinary story. The stranger in the photographs had turned out to be the man I'd always known. And together, we faced whatever came next, not as the people we had been, but as the people we had become through loss, reunion, and the ongoing choice to love each other anew each day.
Summer arrived with a heat wave that left us grateful for the ocean breezes that cooled our coastal town. Richard and I developed a routine of early morning walks on the beach before the day grew too hot, often stopping to collect interesting shells or watch shorebirds darting along the water's edge. On one such morning, as we sat resting on a piece of driftwood, Richard's phone rang, an unusual occurrence so early. "It's Michael," he said, answering. His expression quickly changed from relaxed to concerned. "When? Is he all right?" I moved closer, trying to hear what was happening. Richard listened intently, asking occasional questions, then promised we'd come right away. "What's wrong?" I asked as he ended the call. "Tanny's in the hospital. Appendicitis. They're prepping him for surgery now." We hurried home to pack overnight bags, then drove the 3 hours to Charlotte, making better time than usual, with Richard pressing the speed limit in a way he normally wouldn't. By the time we reached the hospital, Danny was already in recovery. Michael met us in the waiting room, looking exhausted but relieved. Surgery went well, no complications. They caught it before it ruptured. "Thank goodness," I said, embracing our son. "Can we see him?" "Soon. He's still pretty groggy from the anesthesia." As we settled into the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, I noticed Michael watching Richard with an odd expression. "What is it?" Richard asked, catching the look. Michael hesitated. This is the first real family emergency since you've been back. I realized I'd gotten used to handling these things alone." A shadow crossed Richard's face. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for so many of them." "No, that's not what I meant," Michael said quickly. "I'm glad you're here, both of you. It's just strange how quickly life can snap back to normal, like there was never a gap." I understood what he meant. In moments of crisis, old patterns reasserted themselves. Richard taking charge of the drive, me packing necessary supplies, Michael handling the medical details. A family unit functioning as it had for decades, muscle memory overriding the years of separation. When we were finally allowed to see Danny, he was pale but smiling weakly,
an IV in his arm and monitors beeping softly beside his bed. "Hey, kid," Richard said, gently squeezing his grandson's hand. "Heard you had quite an adventure today." "It hurt so bad," Danny admitted, "but the doctors were cool. They let me see pictures of my appendix after they took it out." "Typical science nerd," Michael said affectionately, ruffling his son's hair. "Wonder where he gets that from," I teased, looking pointedly at both my husband and son, science teachers both. We stayed with Danny until he drifted off to sleep, then took turns keeping watch through the night. When my shift came, in the quiet hours before dawn, I sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall, struck by how vulnerable he looked in sleep. The tough teenage facade was gone, revealing the child still present beneath. Richard joined me around 5, bringing coffee from the hospital cafeteria. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, handing me a cup. "Too many memories of hospitals." I knew he was thinking of his own stay after the shooting, the weeks of recovery, the pain, the uncertainty. "This is different," I said softly. "Danny will be fine." Richard nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about what Michael said about handling emergencies alone. How many times did he rush to a hospital without me there to help? How many times did you?"
Richard, no, let me say this. He took a deep breath. I made the decision to disappear to protect you both. I still believe it was necessary given what we knew then, but the cost, sometimes I wonder if it was worth it. I thought carefully before responding. The past is written in stone. We can't change it, only learn to live with it. What matters is that you're here now, for this emergency and whatever comes next. He reached for my hand, his eyes fixed on Danny's sleeping form. I just don't want to miss anything else. You won't, I assured him. We're together now. That's what counts. Danny was discharged the following afternoon with instructions for rest and follow-up care. Michael insisted we stay at his house rather than a hotel, and we agreed, though I suspected Richard was as apprehensive as I was about returning to our son's home. Our previous visit at Christmas had been carefully planned and structured. This unplanned stay felt more intimate, more potentially fraught. That evening, after Danny was settled comfortably on the living room couch with video games for distraction, Michael opened a bottle of wine and suggested we sit on the back porch. The summer night was warm, fireflies blinking in the garden Sarah had meticulously maintained. "I've been meaning to ask you both something," Michael said after we'd settled into the wicker furniture. "Something important." Richard and I exchanged glances, sensing the serious turn in conversation. Danny's essay, it got me thinking about our family story, about how much of it isn't written down anywhere. "The book," Richard began, "covers the highlights for the public, but there's so much more. Details only you two know, feelings you've never shared. I want to understand, really understand what happened during those 3 years, for Danny's sake and for mine." I felt Richard tense beside me. We'd shared parts of our story, with the FBI, with the ghostwriter, with Danny for his essay, but never the full, unvarnished truth, with all its pain and complexity. "What exactly are you asking, Michael?" I said carefully. He set down his wineglass. "I want to record your stories, both of you, separately at first, then together. Your experiences during the separation, how you felt, what you did, a complete oral history, just for our family." "Why now?" Richard asked. Michael looked at his father directly. "Because Danny's appendicitis reminded me how fragile life is, how quickly things can change, and because," he hesitated, "because I still have questions, things I need to understand about what happened. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I'm not sure I can talk about some of those things, he finally said. Not because I don't want to share them with you, but because they're raw. I understand, Michael said, but would you try? For us? I watched my husband struggle with the request, seeing the conflict on his face. He'd spent 3 years in isolation, then months rebuilding our life together. Revisiting the darkest period might reopen wounds still healing. I'll do it, I said, surprising both men. I think it's important for our family to have the complete story, however difficult it may be to tell. I turned to Richard, but only if you're comfortable too. Richard looked at me, then at our son. All right, he agreed quietly, but some parts may have to wait. Michael nodded, understanding. We'll go at your pace. No pressure. The next morning, while Danny rested and Richard helped Sarah with yard work, Michael set up recording equipment in the guest room where I was staying. Just talk naturally, he instructed, positioning a small microphone. Start wherever you want. I'll edit it all together later. Left alone with the blinking red light of the recorder, I took a deep breath and began. My name is Vivian Elizabeth Wilson. I'm 79 years old. This is the story of the 3 years I believed my husband was dead and how I discovered the truth. The words came more easily than I expected. I spoke about the shock of Richard's supposed death, the numbness of the funeral, the long nights alone in our too-empty house. I described the grief support group that had saved my sanity, the garden I'd planted to keep my hands busy when my mind wouldn't rest. I talked about the first time I noticed something strange in the digital photos, the figure watching from the background that I now knew had been digitally inserted to lure me to Arizona. The fear, the confusion, the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, Richard might still be alive. When I finished, nearly 2 hours had passed. I felt drained but oddly lightened, as if setting down a heavy burden I'd carried too long. That afternoon, it was Richard's turn. He was more hesitant, his responses initially measured and careful. But as he continued, his story flowed more freely. The desperate choice to disappear, the fake identity, the isolation of his new life. The hardest part, I overheard him telling Michael, wasn't the physical danger or the Spartan living conditions. It was the silence. No one to talk to about my real life, my real thoughts. No one who knew the real me. Later, Michael recorded us together, asking questions that helped fill gaps in our separate narratives. How had we each coped with holidays and anniversaries? What had sustained us through the darkest times? How had we rebuilt trust after the reunion? Some questions were painful to answer. Others led to revelations, things Richard and I had never shared, even with each other. I used to drive by our old house sometimes, Richard admitted, surprising me. Just to see if your car was there, to know you were okay. I'd park down the block and wait, sometimes for hours, just to catch a glimpse of you gardening or getting the mail. You risked exposure just to see me? I asked, astonished. He nodded. It was reckless. Delgado would have been furious if he'd known, but I couldn't help it. I needed to see you, even from a distance. I thought about those lonely days, the strange feeling I sometimes had of being watched. Had some part of me sensed his presence? On our last evening in Charlotte, with Danny recovering well and our recordings complete, Michael presented us with a small package.
"A thank you," he said, "for sharing your stories." Inside was a digital audio player with headphones and a note explaining that he'd already edited together some of our separate recordings into a single narrative. That night, back in our guest room, Richard and I listened together, headphones split between us. It was surreal hearing our voices alternating, describing the same time period from such different perspectives. Me in Charlotte, grieving a husband who wasn't dead. Richard in Arizona, living half a life without his family. At one point, the recording captured a moment I had completely forgotten, my description of planting daffodil bulbs on what would have been our 50th anniversary. I put them along the front path, 50 bulbs for 50 years. I told myself it was a memorial to our marriage, but really, I think I was trying to believe in renewal, that something beautiful could grow from such loss. Richard's voice followed. On our 50th anniversary, I hiked up to a ridge overlooking Sedona. I brought a bottle of champagne, the same brand we'd had at our wedding. I opened it at sunset and poured 2 glasses. I drank mine. I poured hers out over the red rocks. A libation to a ghost who didn't know she was being haunted. Tears streamed down my face as I listened. Beside me, Richard was also weeping silently. We had been so close that day, spiritually connected across the miles, yet physically separated by circumstances neither of us had chosen. When the recording ended, we sat in silence, still holding hands, until Richard finally spoke. "I don't regret much in my life, Viv, but I regret missing those 3 years with you. I regret the pain my absence caused. I know, and I've forgiven you for that. Maybe it's time you forgave yourself." He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed, but clearer somehow. "Maybe it is." In the morning, as we prepared to return home, Danny insisted on walking us to our car despite his surgeon's orders to rest. "I'd been thinking," he said, leaning carefully against the car door, "about my essay and now Dad's recordings." "What about them?" Richard asked, loading our small suitcases into the trunk. "It's like we're preserving the story, making sure it doesn't get lost or forgotten." Danny looked thoughtful. "Like those old family Bibles where people used to write down births and deaths and important events." I smiled at the comparison. "I suppose we are creating a kind of family history." "I want to add to it," Danny said earnestly. "When I'm older, record my memories of when Grandpa came back, how things changed, so my kids will know the whole story someday." Richard put his arm around Danny's shoulders, careful of his surgical incision. "I think that's a wonderful idea." As we drove home, I thought about Danny's words. Our story wasn't just ours anymore. It had become part of the family narrative, something that would be passed down, reinterpreted, learned from. The painful parts and the joyful reunion, the deception and the forgiveness, all of it woven into the tapestry of our shared history. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, noticing my thoughtful expression. "Legacy," I said. "Not money or possessions, but stories. The ones we leave behind." Richard nodded, understanding. I used to worry about being forgotten during those 3 years. That I'd die alone in Arizona and no one would ever know what had really happened to me. And now? He glanced at me, a small smile touching his lips. Now I know our story will outlive us both. Through Michael, through Danny,
Maybe someday through Danny's children. He reached for my hand. The stranger in the photographs will never be a stranger again. I squeezed his hand, watching the coastline appear in the distance, our adopted hometown coming into view. Home. Not the place we'd spent most of our lives, but the place we'd chosen for our second chance. Never a stranger, just a lost traveler finding his way home.
Fall painted our coastal town in subdued colors, more subtle than the brilliant foliage of our old home in Charlotte, but beautiful in its own way. The tourists had largely departed, leaving the beaches peaceful for our morning walks. On one such morning, as we strolled along the shoreline collecting shells, Richard suddenly stopped, pressing his hand to his chest. "Are you all right?" I asked, immediately concerned. "Just a twinge," he assured me, but his face was pale. "Let's sit for a minute." We found a bench overlooking the ocean. Richard's breathing gradually steadied, but I noticed him wincing occasionally. "We should call Dr. Patel," I said, referring to the cardiologist who had monitored Richard since his shooting. The bullet that had damaged his lung had also caused some cardiac issues that required ongoing care. "It's nothing," Richard insisted, "just overdid it a bit." But I was already dialing. My teacher's voice, the one that had quelled rowdy third graders for decades, brooking no argument. Dr. Patel managed to see us that afternoon. After an examination and several tests, his expression grew serious. "There's some irregularity in your heartbeat, Richard," he explained, "and your latest blood work shows elevated markers that concern me. I'd like to do an angiogram to see what we're dealing with." 2 days later, we had our answer. 3 of Richard's coronary arteries showed significant blockage. He would need bypass surgery. "Given your history, the previous chest trauma, your age, there are risks," Dr. Barrett explained carefully. "But without intervention, the risk of a major cardiac event is substantial." Richard listened calmly, asking detailed questions about the procedure, recovery time, success rates. Ever the science teacher, seeking data to make an informed decision. In the car afterward, however, his composure cracked. "I just found my way back to you," he said, voice breaking. "I can't bear the thought of leaving you again." I reached across the console to take his hand. "You're not going anywhere. We're facing this together, just like we promised." The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Michael arrived the night before, staying at our house, to drive us to the hospital at the early hour required. That evening after dinner, Richard excused himself to his workshop. He emerged an hour later with a sealed envelope, which he handed to me. "Just in case," he said quietly. I knew without asking what it contained. A letter to be read if he didn't survive the surgery. I set it aside, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility. "You will be giving this back to me unopened," I said firmly. The morning of the surgery dawned clear and cool. At the hospital, we went through the familiar ritual of check-in, pre-op preparation, consultations with various members of the surgical team. When it was time for Richard to be taken to the operating room, I leaned over to kiss him, trying to memorize every detail of his face. The soft white hair, the lines around his eyes from decades of laughter, and the small scar on his chin from a childhood fall. "I'll be waiting," I promised. "I know," he said, his eyes holding mine. "You always have been." The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. Michael and I sat in the waiting room, attempting small talk, scrolling mindlessly through our phones, counting ceiling tiles, anything to distract from the clock that seemed to move in slow motion. Near the 4-hour mark, when the surgery should have been concluding, a nurse appeared. "Mrs. Wilson?"
"The doctor would like to speak with you." My heart stuttered. Why wasn't the surgeon coming to the waiting room as planned? Why this private conversation? Michael squeezed my hand. "I'm coming with you." We followed the nurse to a small consultation room. Dr. Barrett, the cardiac surgeon, was waiting, still in his surgical cap, though he'd removed his gown. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, and I braced myself for the worst. "Your husband's surgery is complete. We successfully bypassed all 3 blocked arteries." Relief flooded through me, but the surgeon's expression remained serious. "However," he continued, "we encountered some complications. Richard's heart rhythm became erratic during the procedure. We've stabilized him, but he's currently requiring more support than we'd typically expect at this stage." "What does that mean?" Michael asked. "It means we're watching him very closely. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical."
Richard was transferred to cardiac intensive care, a maze of monitors, tubes, and equipment surrounding his still form. His face was pale, a breathing tube obscuring his features. This was worse than after the shooting, when he'd at least been breathing on his own by the time I was allowed to see him. "Talk to him," the ICU nurse encouraged. "He can hear you, even if he can't respond." So I talked. I reminisced about our first date to the university planetarium, how he nervously pointed out constellations, impressing me with his knowledge of the night sky. I reminded him of our honeymoon camping trip, when it had rained for 3 days straight, and we'd played Jim Rummy in our tiny tent, laughing at our misfortune. I spoke of our life in Charlotte, raising Michael, building our careers, planning for a retirement that had taken such an unexpected turn. And I talked about our future, the trip to the Grand Canyon we'd been planning, the woodworking classes Richard wanted to take, Danny's high school graduation, still a few years away. "We have so much left to do," I whispered, holding his limp hand. "So don't you dare think about going anywhere." Night fell. Michael insisted I go home to rest, promising to stay with Richard. I refused. I had spent 3 years sleeping without my husband beside me. I wouldn't leave him now when he needed me most. The night was long, punctuated by the soft beeping of monitors and the quiet efficiency of nurses checking vital signs. Sometime after midnight, an alarm sounded, bringing staff running. I was ushered from the room as they worked over Richard, their urgent voices barely audible through the closed door. 20 minutes later, Dr. Barrett emerged, looking tired but relieved. "We've stabilized him again. His body is struggling to maintain regular heart rhythm, but we've adjusted his medications, which seem to be helping." "Will he—" I couldn't finish the question. The surgeon placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Richard is fighting, Mrs. Wilson, and from everything you've told me about him, he's not a man who gives up easily." Morning brought subtle improvements. Richard's color was better, some of the support equipment had been removed, and the nurses spoke optimistically about his vital signs. By afternoon, they were preparing to remove the breathing tube. I waited anxiously outside the room during the procedure, returning to find Richard conscious, groggy but aware, his eyes finding me as I entered. "Viv," he whispered, his voice raspy from the tube. "I'm here," I said, taking his hand, "right where I belong." Over the next few days, Richard's recovery progressed steadily. He was moved from ICU to a regular cardiac unit, then began the process of rehabilitation, first sitting up, then short walks in the hallway, each day bringing new strength. Michael returned to Charlotte once Richard was out of danger, promising to bring Danny for a visit when Richard was feeling stronger. A week after surgery, as I helped Richard with his prescribed walking exercise in the hospital corridor, he paused, looking out the window at the autumn afternoon. "I had a dream while I was under anesthesia, or maybe when they were resuscitating me. I'm not sure." I waited, not pressing him to continue. "I was in a long hallway with doors on either side,
Behind each door were moments from our life together. Our wedding, Michael's birth, vacations, ordinary dinners at home. But ahead, at the end of the hall, was a door with bright light coming from underneath it. My heart clenched. This sounded like the near-death experiences I had read about. I was moving toward that door, drawn to it somehow. But then I heard your voice talking about the Grand Canyon trip we'd been planning, about Danny's graduation still a few years away. And I stopped. He turned to look at me, his eyes clear and certain. I turned around, Viv. I chose to come back. To you. I cupped his face in my hands, mindful of the surgical scar still healing on his chest. I'm very glad you did. 2 weeks after surgery, Richard was discharged with a long list of instructions, medications, and follow-up appointments. Our house, once so perfect, now presented unexpected challenges, steps that were suddenly difficult, spaces too narrow for the walker Richard temporarily needed. But we adapted. We moved our bedroom downstairs to the guest room. I installed grab bars in the shower. Our neighbors helped rearrange furniture to create wider pathways. Recovery was slower than Richard would have liked. The strong, independent man who had survived 3 years in hiding, who had been shot and survived, now needed help with basic tasks. His frustration was palpable. I hate this, he confessed one evening as I helped him into bed, being so dependent. I know, I said, arranging his pillows the way he liked them. But it's temporary. And besides, you took care of me for decades. My turn now. He managed a small smile at that. I suppose we did promise in sickness and in health. Twice, I reminded him, referring to our beach vow renewal, so you're doubly obligated to let me fuss over you. As weeks passed, Richard grew stronger. The walker gave way to a cane, then to cautious steps on his own. His follow-up appointments brought encouraging news about his heart function. By Christmas, he was well enough for a carefully planned visit from Michael, Sarah, and Danny. On Christmas Eve, as our family gathered in our living room, I noticed Richard watching us all with an odd expression, part wonder, part gratitude. "What are you thinking?" I asked quietly, sitting beside him on the sofa. "That I almost missed this," he said, nodding toward Danny and Michael, who were engaged in a good-natured argument about a video game. "But you didn't," I reminded him. "No." He took my hand. I turned around. I chose this, all of it, even the hard parts, and I'd make the same choice again. After the holidays, as winter settled over our coastal town with mild temperatures and occasional rainstorms, Richard and I began to find a new rhythm. His recovery continued to progress. My role as caretaker gradually eased. We started taking short walks on the beach again, though nothing like our previous long strolls. One evening, in late January, Richard surprised me by setting the dining room table with our good china and lighting candles. "What's the occasion?" I asked, coming in from the garden where I'd been cutting back perennials for spring. "Sit down," he said, pulling out my chair. "I want to talk to you about something." He served a simple meal: baked fish, roasted vegetables, a glass of white wine that his cardiologist had reluctantly approved in moderation. When we'd finished eating, he reached across the table for my hand. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "Next?" "With my health, with us, with our life together." He paused. "The surgery was a wake-up call, Viv. I know I don't have forever." "None of us do," I said softly. "True, but some of us have more urgent reminders than others." He smiled slightly. "I want to make the most of whatever time we have. No more delays, no more, someday we'll do this or that." "What did you have in mind?" "The Grand Canyon, for starters. My doctor says I should be cleared for travel by spring. Then maybe that cruise to Alaska we've talked about. And," he hesitated, "I'd like to see Charlotte again. Not just for a visit. To really show you the city through my eyes after 3 years of watching it from a distance." I squeezed his hand. "I'd like that." "And I've been thinking about the foundation," he continued, referring to the organization we'd established with proceeds from our book. "We've been focusing on helping older adults through transitions. Maybe we could add a specific program for those recovering from health crises. I certainly have some insight into that now." His eyes were bright with purpose, more animated than I had seen him since before the surgery. This was the Richard I knew, always planning, always looking forward. "It sounds wonderful," I said. "All of it. There's one more thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope he'd given me before his surgery, the one I'd returned unopened. "I want you to read this now, not because I'm worried about dying, but because I don't want to wait until I'm gone to tell you what's in it." With slightly trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside.
My dearest Vivian, if you're reading this, we've been separated again, this time permanently. I'm sorry. The cruelest irony would be finding each other after 3 years apart, only to lose each other again so soon. But I want you to know that these past months since our reunion have been the most precious of my life. Every moment with you, every conversation, every shared meal, every night falling asleep beside you has been a gift I never thought I'd have again. When I died the first time, it was a choice made out of fear and a desperate desire to protect you. I would give anything to avoid leaving you again, but if it has happened, please know this. You gave my life meaning. From the day we met at that faculty mixer, you in that blue dress that matched your eyes, me spilling punch on my only decent tie, to our last moments together, you have been the center of my universe, the sun my life orbited around. During those 3 years in Arizona, the only thing that kept me going was the thought that you were safe, living your life, even if it was without me. I watched the moon at night and took comfort knowing you could see it too, connecting us across the miles. If I'm gone, please don't retreat from life as I once did. Continue our work with the foundation. Travel to places we plan to visit together. Spend time with Michael and Danny. Tell our story. And most importantly, know that I died as I lived, loving you completely, without reservation, across time and space and whatever comes after. Until we meet again, in whatever form that may take, your Richard. Tears streamed down my face as I finished reading. Richard moved his chair beside mine, putting his arm around my shoulders. "I meant every word," he said softly, "and I wanted you to hear them while I'm still here to tell you in person." I turned to him, this man who had been my husband for 56 years, who had been lost and found and nearly lost again. "I love you," I said simply, the only words that seemed adequate. "I know," he replied, echoing my certainty. "I've always known." That night, as we lay in bed listening to the distant sound of waves breaking on the shore, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. The altered photographs that had led me to Arizona, the reunion that had nearly ended in tragedy, the heart surgery that had brought us face to face with mortality once again. "Richard," I whispered, not sure if he was still awake. He murmured. "When you saw that light at the end of the hallway, what do you think it was?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might have drifted off. Finally, he spoke. As a science teacher, I should say it was just neurons firing as my oxygen-deprived brain shut down, a physical reaction, nothing more. "But," I prompted, hearing the qualification in his tone. "But as a man who has seen enough of life's mysteries to know how little we truly understand," he shifted to face me in the darkness. "I think it might have been a doorway to whatever comes next. And you chose not to go through it?" "Not yet,"
His hand found mine under the covers. Not while you were still on this side. I nestled closer to him, reassured by the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid presence of him beside me. Whatever doorways awaited us in the future, we would approach them as we had faced everything else, together. In the morning, Richard surprised me by suggesting we walk to the small cafe at the edge of town for breakfast, the longest outing he had attempted since his surgery. "Are you sure you're up for it?" I asked, concerned about the distance. "We'll take it slow," he said, determination in his voice, "and I'll bring my cane just in case." The January day was crisp but sunny, perfect for a gentle walk. We moved at a leisurely pace, Richard stopping occasionally to rest, but insisting on continuing. At the cafe, we claimed a table by the window overlooking the harbor, watching fishing boats heading out for the day's catch. "I've been thinking about Danny's essay," Richard said as we waited for our food. "The Strangers in the Photographs. It's an apt title, isn't it?" I nodded, remembering our grandson's insightful words about how people can become strangers to each other through separation and change. "We're not the same people we were before all this happened," Richard continued. "I'm not the same man who disappeared 3 years ago. You're not the same woman who grieved me." "No," I agreed. "We're not." And yet, he smiled, the morning light illuminating his face. Here we are, finding our way forward together. Our food arrived, blueberry pancakes for Richard, an indulgence his doctor would probably frown upon, and oatmeal with fresh fruit for me. As we ate, I thought about the many mornings we'd shared over 5 decades of marriage, rushed weekday meals before work and school, lazy weekend brunches, anniversary celebrations at fancy hotels. "What are you smiling about?" Richard asked. "Just thinking about all the mornings we've had together and all the ones still to come." After breakfast, we walked slowly back towards home, pausing at a bench overlooking the ocean. The winter sun sparkled on the water, fishing boats dotted the horizon, and seagulls wheeled overhead. "It's a beautiful world," Richard said quietly, "worth coming back for." I took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his palm against mine. "Worth fighting for." He nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon where sky met sea. The strangers in the photographs found each other again and discovered they weren't strangers after all. "Just travelers," I said, completing the thought we'd shared before, finding their way home. And as we sat together, watching the endless rhythm of waves breaking on the shore, I knew that whatever came next, adventures or challenges, joys or sorrows, we would face it together, no longer strangers, but companions on the continuing journey of our extraordinary, ordinary life.